Good artists iterate, but great artists evolve, in my opinion. You know, the Beatles went from Please Please Me in the early 60s to Sgt. Pepper. Picasso went from the Blue period to the Rose period. And Michael Jordan went from being an artist on the basketball court to being an okay baseball player. I know sports. I've seen Space Jam.
That's a joke. I was going to say, so for a lot of artists on this list, very similar to what you said there, a lot of artists on this list got their break in comic books by basically pretending to be somebody else. So by copying some of the hot artists of the time. The industry does kind of force people to do what's popular. But then what's really cool about that is, you know, over time we get to see these artists get their foot in and become the artists they were always supposed to be.
It's all about how it's kind of received, I think. Readers can be kind of sniff out cynicism a little bit. And if it is an artist changing styles to kind of meet trends, or maybe it's a mandate from the publisher, we're certainly going to talk about examples of that. But yeah, sometimes it can just be an artist is curious and is trying to find and evolve their style. And I think that's definitely, I'm going to make a case for that with some of these artists. So, hey heroes, I'm Josh from Panels to Pixels.
And I'm Matty from Stoked.
And like Ozzy and Kelly Osbourne sang in 2003, we're going through changes because this is what happens when comic artists change style.
That's fucking brilliant. A lot of the artists on this list are either British or European comic artists, because that's very much my thing. And the artist I wanted to start with is Barry Windsor-Smith.
Ooh.
And much like many other artists out of his ilk, he basically started his career by copying Jack Kirby. Jose Ladron, Chris Steranko, plenty of other artists all started their career like this. But as I mentioned before, what's really cool is once they're in, we then see all of these artists then kind of going on to express their own personal art style. And they become far more experimental, following their curiosities and changing their styles. But Barry Windsor-Smith, I think, is just one of the best kind of guys who started out copying Kirby. He started his career in Marvel UK, so he's really close to my heart for the kinds of work that he used to do. But if you look at his earliest work from the 70s, like look at his Conan work and his very, very early like Avengers work, it is super Kirby coded. These big, long, powerful thighs, all that kind of crackling energy in the background. But throughout the 80s and the 90s, we can see him developing a completely different style. I mean, no doubt he was hired because he could do such a good Jack Kirby, but it's really cool that Marvel kind of let him develop this much more sensitive, much more detailed, cross-hatching style, and just really fantastic pen work. I would say arguably the most famous comic that he's done, or certainly from this era, is Weapon X at Marvel. But I also really like Rune, which he did at Malibu in the late 90s, and that's just super good pen work. Much as I'd mentioned before, his transformation wasn't overnight. It was slow and steady, and it's so good to see that evolving over those years.
I love that you've brought up Barry Windsor-Smith. One of my favourite artists. Weapon X is I would put a case forward for that as being one of the very best 90s Marvel publications. And I'm somewhat of an expert on 90s comics. And yeah, what I love about it is you see the kind of influence of classical art on Barry Windsor-Smith. And also obviously that European style that you've talked about as well. I love also his stuff around the same time as Weapon X. He did Archer and Armstrong at Valiant.
Yes.
And I think he's a great example to start off with of someone who is developing himself as an artist. Based on what I know about him, I don't think he's anybody who would take orders from Marvel editorial. In fact, I happen to know for a fact that he did Weapon X completely off his own back. He wasn't commissioned to do that by Marvel. So yeah, it's truly someone developing their own style and not just reacting to trends. Okay, so as a kind of counterpoint to Barry Windsor-Smith, I want to talk about Herb Trimpe.
You'll never guess who's number 2 on my list.
No way.
Herb Trimpe. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, fantastic. Because I think that, I want to talk about this, but I think there is some questions about whether maybe his later change in style was reacting to what was popular, what was current, and how much of that was off his own back or how much of it was pressure from Marvel. So yeah, Herb Trimpe, classic kind of Silver Age kind of late 60s, early 70s at Marvel doing the Incredible Hulk. One of the defining artists on the Incredible Hulk, I would say.
Yeah, he did the he did the debut Wolverine issue.
That's right. Yeah. Didn't create Wolverine, but was the artist on that first. He didn't design it, I should say, but on Hulk 181. But yeah, I mean, he again is someone who was kind of working in that Jack Kirby tradition, very kind of the Marvel house style, big heroic characters. And he became like a fan favorite because of that. In fact, actually, there's a great documentary that was made, I think, in the late 60s. I think it's called We Love You, Herb Trimpe. Do you know about this?
No, I don't. This sounds great.
Yeah, I think it's on YouTube and it's all shot on like, I don't know, Super 8 or something like that. It's well worth checking out because it's kind of, more than anything, it's a great document for what fan culture was in the late 60s, early 70s.
Love it. I just want to jump in because I don't know if you'll have this in your research, but one of the reasons I selected Herb Trimpe is also he co-created the original Captain Marvel for Marvel UK here in the 1970s.
Oh, nice.
So it's a little thing that he did outside of American comics.
I love that I've got you on as the UK comics expert. I genuinely love it, and I always feel like such a sham because I'm such an Americana. What's the American version of an Anglophile? I'm an Americanophile.
Yeah, sure.
that doesn't sound good. On top of everything, I think if you look historically at Trimpe's work, it's, solid storyteller, great draftsman. But if you jump ahead to the early 90s, Marvel was in kind of a bad place. I've read some of his journal entries at the time, and he talks about how he was maybe kind of hurting for work, and that might have informed his decision to start aping the kind of Image guys style a little bit, particularly on the 1993 series Fantastic Four Unlimited. And you definitely see those kind of like squinty Rob Liefeld faces. And it's kind of a weird mix because he still has those kind of like big classic heroic bulbous, Silver Age figures, but then with these like lots of rendering on the faces and these kind of like small scrunched up anguished faces.
It does look like that school, but it still has Trimpe's energy. So it does have its own kind of unique vibe to it. I think he adds his own energy, and I think the result is honestly great. Like I actually really love that Fantastic Four Unlimited. That it's quite meme-ish, but like that completely insane savage Ant-Man design where he's like all spikes and helmets and stuff. It's like phenomenal stuff. Like this is just great characterization, great stuff. And from what I gather, although Trimpe, I think, said that he did basically do this for financial reasons, he wanted to keep working, so he did what was popular. Apparently, he also just had a really good time. Like, he wasn't sad about this. He was enjoying trying something new and exploring, a different art style. So this actually opens up a much more interesting conversation where we can say if Trimpe was happy to do it, and if everyone else is doing it as well, I think that there's a question here about what style really is. Because if this wasn't Trimpe's natural illustration style, do we know for sure that the stuff he was doing 20 years earlier was his natural artistic style, or was he just doing the same thing then? And then you can go, actually, when it's work for hire and you have to kind of be prepared to draw what's popular, how often actually are we ever seeing an illustrator's authentic style?
This is a huge question that I didn't necessarily think we were going to tackle in this video, but what is style? Lots of people have attempted to define that. There is like an old kind of adage in jazz music that style is the stuff you get wrong.
Oh, nice, yeah.
I actually do have a quote from old Herb here that kind of addresses that directly. No one at Marvel suggested I change the way I draw or ink. I looked at the new guy's stuff and thought, hey, this is great, very exciting. You can always learn from somebody else, no matter how long you've been doing a thing.
There you go.
I think that sums it up, really.
The man knows. Okay, so we've spoken about sort of reasons people would change their style. And I think, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there's any number of kind of reasons which could lead to an artist changing over time. And I think it's really good to appreciate that change and appreciate, even just like getting older, appreciate aging. We can see this in the world of classical artists. You mentioned this yourself. Picasso, who went through different periods of his life that reflected his like political ideas, his social status, all these different things influenced his art. Monet, whose art changed because his body changed. He his eyesight deteriorated, so he completely changed the way he painted. And then when he had corrective surgery, he hated all of the work that he'd done previously, and his style changed again. And that's just, the natural aging of his body. And I think these are important things to think about, because sometimes this happens in comics too. So the artist I've chosen to speak about here is Ian Churchill. Churchill was a British artist, mostly again working at Marvel, US Marvel. Did a good run of really good Cable in the 90s, really big, heroic proportions, really good line work. Essentially, Churchill was basically aping Jim Lee in order to get more work. So again, a similar story. And no doubt this story will come up more times throughout this video. Then he made the jump to Image after those guys did. And then eventually he actually followed Liefeld over to Awesome Comics when he moved from Image over to Awesome. But over the years of drawing these big, bombastic, very, very detailed, cross-hatchy Jim Lee style illustrations, Churchill started to develop chronic pain in his shoulder. So bad, in fact, that he needed to have surgery. And he found that essentially it was drawing in that art style had given him like a repetitive strain injury. And after the surgery, he found that not drawing in that style anymore helped with the pain. So he basically completely changed his art style because it caused him physical pain. And in the 2009 Hulk ongoing, which Churchill was drawing, his art style completely changed to then facilitate this like change in his physical health. His style became way more fluid, uses these much more kind of more expressive forms, much rounder and bolder, much smoother, as opposed to that, very scratchy, cross-hatching style that those Image guys were more famous for. And Churchill actually said after this, because a few people at the time, would write into the letters page and be like, what the hell's going on with the Hulk art? It's completely changed from one issue to the next. It's like it's a whole different artist. And Churchill actually said that this was his original illustration style. So kind of following on from my previous point, he was like, no, this is actually how I used to draw before I got into comics and basically adopted that Marvel and then later that Image house style. So it kind of feels like there's a bit of cyclical storytelling going on here.
Okay, that was a great kind of deep cut there, maybe. But let's go very mainstream, classic artist. In fact, comics' favorite Nepo baby, John Romita Jr. Kind of needs no introduction, really. Obviously, the son of the legendary John Romita Sr., not only defining Spider-Man artist, but defining kind of Marvel Silver Age artist. And John Romita Jr. comes up through the late 70s and early 80s, very much kind of doing his dad's style. It's not one for one, but it's kind of in that tradition, certainly. Now, what's really interesting to me as I did this research, I didn't realize this, but a lot of that could be to do with the fact that he wasn't actually allowed to do full pencils in his early career at Marvel. He was just doing breakdowns. And so it wasn't until actually in the late 80s when he starts working on Daredevil with Ann Nocenti in what has kind of become like quite a cult kind of run, Ann Nocenti's Daredevil run with John Romita Jr. on art. It's like kind of lives in the shadow of Frank Miller's run, who I'm sure we're going to talk about at some point. But yeah, suddenly John Romita Jr. kind of just appears fully formed almost during this time. And I think it is because he was allowed to do that full pencils and really develop his own voice. It's kind of hard to describe what that looks like. I think that he's been defined as kind of very blocky, very angular style. As you get more into the modern day and kind of digital coloring kind of goes over the top of that, I always think his style kind of looks like plasticine-y, almost like has like a claymation kind of aspect to it. And it's very, very distinctive. It's like, if you think about everyone else who was coming up through the 90s, they all had imitators, as we've talked about, but not many people were imitating John Romita Jr.'s style. In fact, I can't really think of anyone who was doing that exactly.
Iconic pick. The switch from him doing Uncanny X-Men with Claremont to into that Daredevil run with Ann Nocenti, so good. I think he was good. He was a good John Romita Sr., cribber, and then he became a genuinely brilliant illustrator with that. I mean, Punisher Warzone is my favourite of his, I think. I think his artwork and that is just absolutely peak.
And he also did the Cable miniseries in the 90s, speaking of Cable.
Can't get away from Cable.
And then obviously Daredevil, The Man Without Fear with Frank Miller. That's kind of him at his most John Romita Jr.-y.
With the embossed covers.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get more 90s than that.
Yeah.
And then I think like on Amazing Spider-Man, in fact, my first issue of Amazing Spider-Man was in that Volume 2, issue 22. I talked about it recently. And he was the artist on that. So that kind of style, that really imprinted on me that was kind of a defining look for Spider-Man. And then as JMS joins the book, I think that becomes like his style becomes even more iconic. And obviously he's had a long association with Spider-Man now, had several defining kind of runs on the title. And I have to say, nobody draws a beaten up, swollen Peter Parker face better than John Romita Jr. And again, it's because of that plasticine style and the squared off faces and jaws. And he just draws like a big egg on Peter Parker's head that just looks so painful. But it is an acquired taste, I will say that. I know that he's a kind of a contentious artist because it's very stylized. And again, I think this is going to be a recurring theme as we talk more about some of these artists, is that the more stylized something is, the more contentious it becomes.
I think that's probably a good segue into like just getting a bit passionate for a second, because the more unique and bizarre someone's art style gets, generally speaking, the more I like them as an illustrator. I like to be able to look at something and know who did it. And also like to see people having fun and expressing themselves in like unique ways. And it does kind of get me down because I have friends who only like house style illustration and they don't like it when an artist kind of moves outside of those boundaries and, say, oh no, on an indie comic or whatever, like that's fine, but not Batman, not Superman. You can't have someone, or Spider-Man, you can't have someone who's got too weird an art style drawing too iconic a character. And I disagree with that massively. I'm a huge fan of big art styles.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're aligned on this. And, I'm the person who coined the term realism is overrated. I definitely lean more towards stylization in comic books. And, a little sizzle for someone we're going to talk about. They're going to be in the thumbnail, this artist. It's, I'm burying the lead massively. But I've definitely got some things to say about the responses to an artist on this list.
I do too. Get a few pints from me. I was at the pub for a friend's birthday a few weeks ago, and this came up in conversation. I went off. I went off for time about this. Very passionate about it.
I would love to have an argument with someone in a pub about comics.
It's the best, man. It's the best.
that doesn't happen in the pubs near me.
If we're going from this idea of artists who break away from house style and like slowly over time become a bit more esoteric and a bit perhaps controversial, the first name I thought of when you said you wanted to put together a list of artists whose style changed over time, the first person that popped into my head was Mick McMahon, or Mike McMahon, but not the Mike McMahon who wrote for Rick and Morty and co-created Star Trek Lower Decks. Not that one. Mick McMahon is a 2000 AD artist, and he's one of probably the all-time great 2000 AD artists. Mick was in fact the first person to draw Dredd in a comic book. The first issue where Dredd appears, which is Prog 2 in 1977, is drawn by Mick McMahon, but it is at the time very clearly based on Carlos Ezquerra's artwork. Carlos Ezquerra had worked in British comics for years before this and had actually designed Judge Dredd. He'd come up with the character, like the character sheet. And his artwork in this issue is very, very similar to Ezquerra's. And Ezquerra's artwork is very European. It's lots of mark making, lots of very fluid forms, good use of bold shading, stuff like that. And I don't know that McMahon was told to copy Ezquerra. He may have been, but there's just every chance that, like every other artist on this list, he took that upon himself in order to kind of get him into the industry and to get himself working. But over the years, Mike McMahon has drawn a lot of Dredd. He's been drawing Dredd for 40 years. He's still going. And very quickly, in fact, he started to establish a different art style to Carlos Ezquerra. He branched off pretty early on, and he just kept going down his own path. And this is something, unlike Marvel and DC, this is something that 2000 AD actively nurture and encourage in their artists, and they always have. I read an interview, I don't know when or where, but I read an interview with Tharg, the editor of 2000 AD, and Tharg said that essentially we don't have house styles at 2000 AD. Everybody is free to draw whichever character in whichever style they want. You can draw Dredd however you want. There's really no template, go for broke, which I think is a lovely position to have as a publisher. And we can see that once McMahon's in, he really starts to take this to heart. So throughout the Cursed Earth, we can see his art style really stripping back and getting into far more energetic, far looser style. It's not got the control that Ezquerra had. And then this just gets more and more pronounced. And over the years, you know, the forms start elongating and the limbs distend. Everything becomes far more angular, far more abstract, and I think better. Like it just gets better and better the more this guy draws. McMahon actually was given a run on Batman during the British invasion. A ton of 2000 AD artists ended up working at DC, and he was given a run in Legends of the Dark Knight. And I'm sure Josh agrees with me here, but Legends of the Dark Knight is pretty much like the peak Batman run. The idea of having a revolving team of just creative people doing what they want, letting rip, just awesome stuff. And his bit of Batman in there is just wicked. The fact that he was allowed to draw Batman, loads of fun. I would say if Mick McMahon is an artist who you're not familiar with, and maybe you want to go and pick up a couple of strips to kind of see his visual style, I would say The Vampire Effect is a really good story, which was recently collected in the Best of 2000 AD Volume 2. There's a really good example of McMahon's, I would say, inimitable style, very similar to JR in that it's very graphic, very blocky, very angular. And it just has its own character and its own tone. Yeah, he's one of my all-timers. Genuinely, what an illustrator.
Okay, I'm going to pull out one that I think you're going to be a fan of. And in fact, their early style is not too dissimilar from Mick McMahon. So, Chris Bachalo, are you a fan, Matty?
Absolutely, I am. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, perfect. Okay, was this on your list?
He's not on my main list, but he was on my backup list.
Yeah, so Chris Bachalo, for me, this is, again, is the era I came into Marvel Comics, and he was one of the predominant X-book artists on stuff like Generation X and also on Uncanny. But we'll get to that. He kind of cut his teeth at DC as part of the Vertigo imprint on Shade the Changing Man in the early 90s. And I don't know if you'd agree with me that kind of Vertigo had a house style of its own.
Yeah, 100%.
It feels like Bachalo was very much within that, the parameters of that anyway. It was distinct, but it was kind of almost like Hot Topic-y.
Yeah.
If we're using that as a point of reference, we don't have Hot Topic in the UK, so I don't know if I'm using that correctly. But kind of emo-y, scratchy, kind of very black and inky, you know, that kind of bold use of light and shade that we've already talked about. And there is something kind of slightly subversive feeling about his early work. But I would say that he kind of takes on a kind of a whole new characteristic when he gets poached by Marvel and gets assigned to creating this new X team, which is Generation X, the kind of like poster children of 90s X-Men. And you get that like big influx of the kind of manga influence that was definitely happening across the X books and across Marvel because of the Image guys and stuff like that. But I think Chris Bachalo kind of takes that to its logical conclusion with a very heavily manga-influenced style and a much more modern style, and something that would kind of become the Marvel house style in the late 90s with artists like Joe Mad, and even the Kubert brothers kind of started to work in that style as well. It kind of, in contrast to that sketchy, scratchy, inky style, it becomes very clean, very cartoony.
Which I did really love that. And I liked his work on Shade the Changing Man, because I know I've recommended that book to you, Josh. And because I came up with comics in Vertigo and DC. My first ever comic was Swamp Thing, and I just got into all comics through that. So all those gothy, moody artists of the 90s I was super into. But I followed Bachalo as he then moved over to Marvel and changed into that kind of more anime-influenced cartoony style. And yeah, the Doctor Strange stuff he did, the X-Men stuff, it was all really awesome. The one thing that's made me wonder, and this kind of harks back to a point I made earlier in the video, and that is that do we think that this is him evolving as an artist or recognizing that times are changing and forcing a change within his own art style? I think it's I don't think there's an answer here. It's quite a rhetorical question, but it's just an interesting thing to kind of think about. And I suppose really to be a great artist requires that level of flexibility to be able to pivot and to move into new things.
And I think, as I talked about, I think it was definitely something in the zeitgeist at Marvel, that manga influence and that more cartoony style. So yeah, it's hard to pinpoint what was surrounding influence and what was kind of natural evolution of his style. But, you know, that's the milieu of artistic influence, isn't it? As we talked about, it's very hard to define what somebody's style is, and style doesn't exist in a vacuum like that. Yeah, the only other point I wanted to touch on is that later he does a creator-owned book at Image called Steampunk in the 2000s. And I would say that that's like another style change for him. It becomes very maximalist, very intricate. It's kind of bringing in a bit more of that kind of like ornate line work from his early work, kind of combined with that cartoony manga style. And I love it because it's that like real exaggerated forms that I love, that like anatomy book thrown out the window. Everything gets very stretchy. Eyes get very heads get and eyes get very kind of chibi style almost, and yeah, everything just gets warped and distorted in a way that's very pleasing to me.
I've noticed that a lot of the artists that we talk about all worked in and around the 90s. Some of them started earlier, some of them didn't, but all the key work was the comics we read as teenagers, isn't it?
I hope you're not suggesting that I have a unconscious bias.
Only slightly. All right, so speaking of 90s comic book artists with scratchy art styles, to break the mold, I've gone with pretty much the exact same thing again. But I would say unique from any of the other artists that I put on my list, Jae Lee came out of the gate early on in his career with actually a pretty sick illustration style already. I'm specifically thinking about his 1991 Namor run, which if you haven't seen it, it's super good from an art perspective. It's super dark. It's really moody. It's really scratchy. It has really great color as well. Like it's super bright, even though the artwork is like super, super dark and scratchy. It has a kind of J.O. bar, moody, gothy feel, which for Namor is just, yeah, so cool. It's incredibly 90s, and it's exactly the kind of thing that you would have seen at like Image or Vertigo. Actually, it kind of fits into that Vertigo gothy house style. And then he went into Executioner's Song, so he was doing the X books, and you just know throughout all of this, because this was the time that Image had their eye on him. You know, you can imagine they were courting him this entire time, trying to get him to come out of Marvel and go over to what they were doing, because his style worked so well and would have worked so well with what they were doing. Obviously, you know, he did. I think he did eventually, but his style just absolutely ruled, even at the gate. But by the time I got into Jae Lee, his style had actually changed completely differently. So when I got into him, he had this really lean illustration style. It was far less splotchy, far less scratchy, and much more refined black work, much more refined shading. I would say a lot more spidery, like very, very attentive pen style. The first book of his I think I picked up was the Transformers G.I. Joe run from Dreamwave. I was super into Transformers books in the 2000s, and this is a really peak book. This is drawn so immaculately. And then he went on to do the Dark Tower comics at Marvel with Richard Isanova, which again, just another classic like 2000s combination. Really, really great stuff. I remember that he was announced to do Batman and Superman. He did a Batman-Superman crossover about 10 years ago. And I remember having a heated discussion in my friendly local comic shop about whether or not an illustrator with a style as dynamic and as stylized as Jae Lee should essentially be allowed to do a Batman Superman comic, and it should be done in a house style. It shouldn't be done in such a stylized illustration style. And I mean, I don't know if that person just didn't like Jae Lee or whether they just didn't get the vibe, because I remember the poster. The poster itself is sick. So yeah, I absolutely love Jae Lee. I don't know how popular he is, but I've been a fan of his for a long time. And I'm always excited to see him getting work. Whenever something comes out and I see his name on it, it's a guaranteed buy from me.
Okay, well, let's finish up. I'm going to ask you a loaded question here, Matty.
Okay.
Are you a Frank Miller fan?
Absolutely. Of course I am.
The only wrong answer to that is to say, yeah, particularly his post 9/11 work.
Yeah, holy terror. Yeah. There is a Claremont Frank Miller. Is it a Wolverine story? And it's it's like drawn by Miller and written by Claremont, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember it coming out, and everyone was like, "Oh, Frank Miller should have been writing that, not drawing it." And I was like, "Bro, this rules. What's wrong with you?"
Well, that's a great example to start with, because that's very much in the classic Frank Miller style. That's 1982, I think, that Wolverine mini with Claremont, and it's kind of contemporaneous to his Daredevil work, and you're starting to see some of that like kind of film noir aesthetic influence. And then also on the Wolverine stuff, you're definitely seeing the Asian influence, the Japanese influence from comics' biggest weeaboo, Frank Miller. But the thumbnail for this video is going to be that classic Frank Miller Wolverine.
Hell yeah.
Against the modern Wolverine. Have you seen the variant covers that he did a few years ago?
Yeah.
And you know, that's quite a dramatic change.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you would agree with me that it's not a decline in style.
I absolutely
like
agree.
A lot of commentary about it is.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think, again, if you look at the kind of arc of that progression, it makes a lot more sense when you look at, you know, Dark Knight Returns is what leaps out to me as kind of where you really start to see the modern Frank Miller solidified that style.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously Sin City is kind of an evolution of that. Again, it's that noir style, but it's much more high contrast and it's more expressionistic. But most importantly, I think he's abstracting his forms. He's breaking things down to the most rudimentary forms in order to make them as dynamic as possible. I think that's the argument I would make.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's important to remember that, you know, when with artists and with art, mistakes rarely happen. Things generally are the way they are because somebody wanted them to be that way. Frank Miller hasn't accidentally drawn Wolverine like that. That was intentional. He's chosen to do it. And I think a lot of the artists that we've spoken about in this video, I think generally speaking, as you get kind of more confident in what you do and more confident in your art and in your craft, you notice that you can do more with less. And so you notice this with musicians, you notice this with artists, illustrators. They realize that at one time that they would labor over something to make it just so, to get it just right. And as they get more confident in themselves and more self-assured and realizing that actually, do you know what? I can just do a line here and that will look like, you know, an arm. That will look like the outline of a car. You know, I don't need to labor too much. I can use the brains of my audience. They can fill in. And that's really a great thing about illustration is you're not trying to make something look realistic. Comics don't look realistic. They never have. That's never been the agenda. It has always been to deliver, I guess, the maximum amount of message with really the minimum amount of pen work. And Miller's a master of this. He's been doing it for decades. And this is the logical, you know, the logical endpoint, or really where he is right now. Maybe he's only going to get simpler. And I can't wait to see it evolve even further. I can't wait to see his style continue in this vein.
You say that about realism, you know, that's not the point. But I think there is a kind of common misconception that it is the point. I think that I'm trying not to sound too much like a snob here, but I think that realism has become kind of a convenient metric for the less artistically literate comics readership to judge the merits of art. To say how realistic is this? Well, it looks 80% like the real thing, so it's 80% good art. But of course, I'm preaching to the choir here by saying that that's not how it works. And yeah, I think the confidence is a big thing. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but yeah, there's definitely a confidence from Frank Miller's work. Again, kind of, I've seen people online speculate, oh, well, it's his ill health and declining health is why he draws like this now. But I don't buy that. I think that he's someone who has mastered his craft and now can abstract that out and be more experimental, but also, as you say, just be more minimalist and have more confidence in what he's getting across on the page.
Yeah, I think this is exactly it. I think, sure, he's getting on in years, we all are, but plenty of other artists don't do this. I mean, Bernie Wrightson's art got more detailed, if anything, the older he got, and the last work he ever did is astounding, so good. It feels like he's drawing on a wall because his artwork's so packed full of all these tiny little details. He can only have been drawing at a massive scale, but so I know that's like, it's not exactly a fair comparison to compare one artist to another, but I don't think just because Frank Miller is a certain age that he has to draw a certain way. I think he's making a deliberate decision. I've got nothing else, I don't think. I think that's it, right? I just think it's like, do you get the vibe? Do you understand it? I completely agree with your point about realism being a bit of I don't want to say a crutch, because it actually takes a lot of talent to draw something very realistically. But it feels like perhaps a bit political, but it feels like a conservative sort of viewpoint when looking at art, in that there's an objective merit to the art, and that is that, does it objectively look like the thing or not? And the purpose of art is not really to look like the thing, but it's to move you. It's to put you in an emotional space and to convey a message.
Okay, well, thanks, Matty. That was a great discussion. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people telling us that we forgot to mention X. Mm-hmm. Bill Sienkiewicz was one that we both kind of talked about off camera. So maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point. One of the recurring themes here that we've talked about is artists who have kind of mastered their craft. And I would argue that you have mastered the craft of talking about British comics, about 2000s video games, about movies of questionable quality.
Incredibly high quality, thank you.
So, do you want to plug your channel for me?
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I don't think I could do better than that. Yes, my channel is called Stoked. You can find me. There'll be links in the description. I talk about the stuff I loved as a man coming of age. So like my late teens and early 20s, the 2000s Stoked era. If it's got leather coats and vampires are part of the aesthetic, then basically I'm into it. Games, films, comic books, all stuff like that. I love to talk about British and European comics as well, which is, I think, why Josh invited me on. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
That wasn't the only reason I invited you on, not just for your expertise. I just, it's nice to hang out. In fact, we previously, a few years ago, we talked about our favourite superhero soundtracks, which is a criminally underrated video on Panels to Pixels, in my opinion. So go check that one out, and we'll catch you in the next video.